This is the beginning of Media 2. The time is 2:47 p.m. We're back on the record.
Okay. Lieutenant Morefield, we were discussing the internal affairs department, for lack of a better term. Can you tell? We were basically talking about the individual officers that work in that department. They're sergeants, correct?
The investigators are sergeants.
Okay. And is there anybody besides the sergeants that work in the IA department?
Yes.
And who would they be?
They have 4 or 5 lieutenants that supervise the investigating sergeants.
Okay.
There's also a captain, or I'm sorry, they're now called a commander,
Okay.
who's over the entire division. They do have some officers who do things like pull records, maintain records, things like that.
Okay. And who are the lieutenants that are working there?
Currently,
Yes. Or, you know what, yeah, let's start with currently.
actually, since I've been gone from legal for 15 months, I don't even know who's up there right now.
Okay, so let's go with 2015, back when you were there.
Stephanie Gaithy is one of the lieutenants.
Stephanie Gaithy?
I'm sorry, Gaithy, Gaithe.
Okay.
Dirk Bogard, I'm not sure if he was there in 2015, but around that time.
Okay.
I know Shamara Garner was there around that time.
And how do I spell Shamara?
Shamara.
Garner? Okay.
Glenn Riddle was served in internal affairs around that time. And Pete Lopez, I believe, was in internal affairs around that time.
All right. And who was the commander during that time?
It was DJ Williams. Or David Williams.
And you said there were a few officers that worked there?
Yes.
Just doing kind of like clerical, administrative type tasks and duties?
Correct.
Okay. And would you know those officers?
I'm used to know a couple of the names. Rhonda, I don't recall her last name. She maintains records.
Has anybody in 2015 that you've named been promoted since 2015 to different positions?
Yes.
Okay. And who would they be out of the individuals you named?
Pete Lopez is now an assistant chief.
Okay.
And I don't think any of the others have promoted.
Okay. All right. Now, what is the tell me what the city's I guess training procedure is for an internal affairs investigation after the use of force.
The training procedure for
The IA officers investigating.
Well, as I stated before, most of the training is on the job. So the training is going to come from another current internal affairs investigator.
Okay. And tell me the process of an investigation, an internal affairs investigation, specifically regarding the use of force, after the use of force, resulting in a serious injury or death.
Just on the internal affairs side?
Yes.
Okay. So the internal affairs investigator will actually go out to the scene and participate in the scene investigation. And then they'll go into a fact-finding mode where the investigator will gather the facts of the incident. That may entail gathering evidence, obtaining witness statements, obtaining statements from the officers involved, obtaining hospital records and any other records that might be pertinent to the investigation. All of these records will be included in the investigating sergeant's investigative report. The investigating sergeant will write up the report, submit it to his or her lieutenant. The lieutenant will take the report and make conclusions as to whether there are policy violations based on the facts. And the lieutenant will reduce those conclusions into what we call the investigative summary. And the lieutenant will write up the investigative summary. That will be included in the entire internal affairs case, which includes the investigative report, the statements, the evidence, everything that's gathered during the course of the investigation, and that will be submitted to the commander of the Internal Affairs Division, who will also review it for sufficiency and completeness.
Okay. Now, who is it that this report is delivered to once it's completed?
The investigative report,
Yes.
that is delivered to the lieutenant
Okay.
of that particular investigator's lieutenant.
Okay. And then once the lieutenant receives it from the investigator, which I suspect would be one of the sergeants, correct?
Yes.
What does that lieutenant do with that internal affairs file?
They take all the facts of the internal affairs file, including that investigative report, and they write a summary called the investigative summary.
Okay. So it's the lieutenant's job to write the summary of the report, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And who is that summary delivered to?
Summary is delivered to the commander of the Internal Affairs Division.
And what happens once the commander receives it?
In 2015, the process was that it would go from, at that time called captain of the Internal Affairs Division, and it would go to the Professional Standards Command, which was the assistant chief level command that had responsibility for the Internal Affairs Division.
Okay, you said it's called the Professional
Professional Standards Command.
Standards Command. Okay. And explain to me what this Professional Standards Command is. Is that a unit?
So the police department is broken up into different commands, and a command is commanded by an assistant chief. And so, just talking organizationally wise, at that time, Internal Affairs was attached to the Professional Standards Command, and so that command had an assistant chief that led it.
Okay. All right. So IA and the Professional Standards Command kind of worked kind of together in the same bubble?
Internal Affairs reported to Professional Standards Command.
Okay. So it would be the umbrella of IA? Is that better? Is that a way to describe it?
It was the chain of command.
Okay. Okay, got it. So, who was the assistant chief in 2015?
Daniel Perales,
And he's also the assistant chief now?
he's since retired.
Okay. Daniel Perales.
Yes.
Can you spell Perales?
P-E-R-A-L-E-S.
Okay. And do you know why he retired?
I don't know his personal reasons. He retired around the time that many of our assistant chiefs retired for purposes of their pension and their tenure at the time.
Okay. And after the assistant chief receives the report, what happens with the report after it reaches the Professional Standards Command?
So then the case is also given to the Legal Services Unit. And this is just talking 2015 process, where it was reviewed by an attorney.
Okay. What was the purpose for that? That an attorney needs to review the report?
I'm sorry, can I back up
Sure.
and correct something in the process?
Sure.
So it would go to the Professional Standards Command for review, coming out of Internal Affairs.
Okay.
They review the sufficiency and the completeness of the investigation.
Okay.
And then you have a bifurcation depending on whether there are sustained citations of misconduct
Okay.
in the case. If it's if there are sustained citations of misconduct, then it's definitely going to go to a disciplinary committee. Even if there are no sustained citations of misconduct, and you're talking about an officer-involved shooting or a death case, then it still is going to go to the disciplinary committee for review.
Okay. So any death or officer-involved shooting goes to this disciplinary committee regardless of how it's worked up along the chain of command, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, so does it go to Legal Services Unit for review before or after the disciplinary committee?
Well, it goes to the Legal Services Unit to set it up for the disciplinary committee. So an attorney did not see the case at that time before it went to the disciplinary committee. The attorney would see it after it went to the disciplinary committee, and it would go to the Independent Police Oversight Board, or IPOB for short.
Okay. So the legal services, what does it review the report for? Tell me about that process of the legal services unit reviewing the reports.
Sure. A couple different things. Legal Services would review to ensure that the investigation was complete and thorough.
Okay.
Legal Services would also review to ensure that the civil service statutes and the requirements of the meet and confer had been complied, or at least that there was compliance with those governing statutes.
Okay. And if it isn't, does it still go to the disciplinary committee?
Well, Legal Services would see it after the disciplinary committee.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. So this would be during the stage that they see it after the disciplinary committee.
Correct.
And just so we're clear, does legal services see it before it gets to disciplinary committee also?
No.
Okay.
Only on a routing basis, but not as a review basis, if that
And
makes sense.
What do you mean? Yeah, tell me about what do you mean by routing basis?
So, since you said, does it go to Legal Services before the disciplinary committee? The answer is yes, because Legal Services also has a component within it called the Disciplinary Action Unit, and that unit is responsible for making sure that cases go to the correct discipline committee. And so a case would come from the Professional Standards Command to the Disciplinary Action Unit of Legal Services Unit in order to funnel it to the correct disciplinary committee.
Okay. Now, let's say that there is a discipline that takes place. Does it have to occur within the 180 days that we discussed previously?
Not always.
Okay. Tell me about. Tell me what you mean by not always.
So there are exceptions to the 180-day rule. For instance, if an officer is to receive a temporary suspension, which is anywhere from 1 to 15 days of suspension, that suspension must be given within 180 days of the date of discovery. So if an officer committed a violation on one particular day and it actually wasn't discovered until a month later, and at the end of the process the department wanted to give that officer anywhere from a 1 to 15 day suspension, they could do it anywhere in that 180 days after the actual discovery.
Okay. All right. And what happens? What happens if there's an instance where you go beyond the 180 days? Say that it happens on the 180 first day? What are the consequences if you do discipline that officer after that time frame?
So that is something that legal services checks, and if the department, what we say, they blow the 180, then at that point, the department cannot suspend the officer, but a written reprimand is not time barred. So typically, an officer would receive a written reprimand for that infraction.
Okay. And I guess to be more clear, if the department finds and they actually do go ahead and discipline somebody after the 180 days is expired, the consequences come from the meet and confer agreement? Is that right?
The consequences actually come from the Texas Local Government Code and are reiterated in the meet and confer.
Okay. And what are the consequences?
That suspension would be void.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned the IBOA, the Independent, I guess, Oversight Board. Is that right?
The IPOB, yes.
Yeah. So, do they have subpoena power?
They do not.
Okay. And how are they appointed? Do you know?
It is a mayoral appointment.
Okay. Do they have the ability to discipline themselves?
To discipline another member of IPOB?
No.
Oh.
I guess that wasn't clear. Does IPOD have the ability and capability to discipline officers themselves?
No, they do not.
Okay. And if they believe that discipline is necessary, how do they ensure that discipline occurs if they recommend discipline?
Well, I'm not sure that they are actually giving feedback on the discipline itself. They're giving feedback on the sufficiency of the investigation.
Oh, okay. All right. And is there some sort of checklist, or how do they know what's sufficient as far as the investigation is concerned?
So there is an IPOB form that they fill out.
Okay.
And in that form, they have to indicate whether they believe that that the investigation was complete and sufficient.
Okay. And tell me the makeup of this board. Who are the individuals that comprise this board?
So they are civilians. In other words, they're not police officers.
Okay.
And
Are they retired police officers?
I don't think there are any retired police officers. I don't know. I don't know the current makeup. I can tell you, having spoken to them a few years ago, there were lawyers and doctors and those who wanted to be involved in the community.
Okay. All right. And so what are the qualifications to become a board member? Do you know?
That I don't know.
Okay. Is this an open, I guess, type of appointment? Like, I guess, how does the mayor appoint them? How do they become aware that this person wants to be on this board?
I'm not really sure.
Okay. So IPOB, they make recommendations as to the sufficiency of a investigation, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what weight does that hold as far as going back and investigating further or stopping the investigation? Tell me what are the consequences of essentially IPOB finding an investigation to be insufficient?
Sure, it's another step in the process because the department wants to have a good investigation, have an investigation that can be seen as acceptable to the community. And so if IPOB has a problem with, or indicates that they don't believe that an investigation is complete and sufficient, then the department takes that seriously. That doesn't mean that there will be additional investigation every single time. It's going to be just dependent on the case and dependent on the feedback. Granted, IPOB, some of them have an pseudo-investigatory background or maybe a legal background. Many of them do not. And so they may suggest something that is outside the bounds of the law, or simply doesn't square up with how the police procedure must be carried out.
Okay. Now, is there some sort of agreement with IPOB and HPD? Like the meet and confer, something akin to the meet and confer with the union?
Not akin to that, no.
Okay. Is this statutory? Is there anything codified as far as this committee is concerned, or board is concerned?
It's a mayoral executive order. That's how they were created.
Okay. So if this committee or board were to find that there's discipline that, well, they don't do discipline, but they find that there should be additional investigations, or the matter needs to be addressed further, they really have no power to do anything about that, correct?
Well, they have the power to find that and reduce that into the form, and that form will go back to the Assistant Chief of the Professional Standards Command to review that feedback.
Okay. And then it pretty much would stop there, correct?
No.
Does it go back to the board after that?
The actual case would not go back, but the Assistant Chief wanted to make sure that the loop was closed, so to speak, and give feedback to the IPOB about what had occurred with their feedback.
Okay. And are these reports and these investigations, are these public record?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So some of this stuff can be occurring and nobody would ever know in the public that it's occurred. For example, the report going to IPOB and then going back to the Professional Standards Committee for further investigation. All these things could have occurred and the public would never know about it as relates to a particular investigation, correct?
The IPOB are members of the public, and that's why they're there, to have members of the public review internal affairs cases. So yes, the public is aware of it.
Okay, but just the particular members on the board, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Are they able to share this information publicly?
No.
Okay. And is that a part of that executive order that there is to be, I guess, confidential?
I don't recall whether that language is in the executive order.
Okay. But essentially, IPOB can't force the internal affairs to do anything, correct? As it relates to disciplining an officer?
No.
Okay. And so everything they do is just merely suggestions, correct?
It is feedback about the sufficiency, completeness of the investigation.
Okay, and I kind of skipped there, and I'm assuming that it's a suggestion. Do they even get to suggest the discipline for an officer or the outcome that should occur with an officer?
No, they're looking at whether the investigation was complete.
Okay. All right, so now going back to the discipline committee, what are some of the disciplines that are available to the committee that they can hold the officer accountable with?
Well, as a general matter, we have discipline categories that range anywhere from a written reprimand up to indefinite suspension, termination.
Okay. Is there any type of scale or any type of indicator of what type of discipline should equal this? Excuse me. What type of action should equal this type of discipline? Is there any type of chart or scale or anything of that nature that helps, I guess, fair treatment ultimately on the type of discipline?
Yes. Located within a document called the Corrective Action Manual is something we call the Discipline Matrix, and it has a list of behaviors, and matching up with those behaviors, it has the categories of discipline that fit with that behavior. And so the category, depending on the type of infraction, it may be a broad category, or it may be a very specific category. It just depends on the behavior.
Okay. And after the discipline occurs, or this, especially relating to deaths and shooting, who else in the department is made aware of these disciplines or these actions occurring within internal affairs?
As it relates to deaths
Yes.
and serious bodily injuries?
Yes. Or shootings. I think you mentioned just plain shootings as well, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And your question was when there's discipline, is that right?
No, just well, yes. I'll stop there. I think I did say that. So with discipline, who else is made aware of these the disciplinary actions?
Any discipline action that the department takes is a matter of public record, but as far as within department members, it depends on the type of discipline. If it's if the officer is going to be indefinitely suspended, terminated, then the internal affairs will actually notify the officer directly. If it's going to be anything less than that, typically that's handled by the officer's chain of command. So that would answer your question as to who else in the department would know. In those circumstances, the officer's chain of command would be aware.
Okay. And when a person's is considered to be indefinitely suspended, can they come back to work?
So if a person is definitely suspended, a police officer is definitely suspended, they do have a right to appeal. And that right is in the Texas Local Government Code and fleshed out to a greater degree in the Meet and Confer. And that right to appeal can be before the Civil Service Commission or to a independent hearing examiner, commonly referred to as an arbitrator.
Okay. Now, in this particular instance, Officer Harris was suspended, I believe, for a 2-year period, pending the outcome of the Fort Bend County trial and his ultimate acquittal. Did he have to come back in and appeal, or was he just automatically reinstated?
He was never suspended for that incident.
Okay, but he wasn't working for the department for the period that he was on trial, correct?
No, he was on a status, as I recall, called relieved of duty.
Okay, so explain the difference between a relief of duty versus a suspension.
So a suspension occurs after the process has concluded, and the process has concluded that the officer merits discipline, and the suspension days follow the discipline. While the investigation is pending, while the officer is awaiting the finality of the investigation, depending on the severity of the alleged infraction, that officer may be placed on relieved of duty status.
Okay. Now, if an officer is on this relieved of duty status, what happens to the 180 days that we were talking about? Because clearly, if they're relieved of duty, there's already the discovery period. What happens to that period of the 180 days in the event that we find out that there is discipline that the department wants to enact on the officer? Tell me how that's I guess, addressed.
Sure. In those situations, the department would have to file what's called an Attorney General letter, which is something provided for in the Texas Local Government Code. Whenever there's an allegation of a felony or crime of moral turpitude, then the department can send a letter to the Texas Attorney General, and that actually preserves the case past the 180 days, because the idea is that there's a related criminal investigation, or the criminal investigation which is about that incident, for which there's also an ongoing administrative investigation, and the idea is that officers' rights for the criminal investigation should play out before the department makes an administrative decision about their job.
Okay. So the department relies on the outcome of the any criminal proceedings in order to make its final decision, is what you're stating, correct?
I would say that's too general because the department does have a separate administrative investigation. And so I don't think the department relies on that. You can have a situation where an officer may be cleared of criminal charges, but may be fired administratively.
Okay, and so why would the department need to wait for the outcome of a criminal investigation? Would that be because they've already determined administratively there's not going to be any discipline?
No, I just think it is one factor in the final determination, but it's not as if, okay, this is what they determine in the criminal side, so therefore this is what's going to happen in the administrative side. It's not a given.
What if a person waits or let's say the DA or what have you, waits after the 180 days to report that there's been this excessive force or this deadly force or I guess shooting, kind of some of those indicators that you explained. What happens if it's not reported until after the 180 days?
So if the allegation is a felony or crime of moral turpitude, then the department can still file the Attorney General letter in order to preserve that administrative case.
Okay. And is it would it be based? And it's because it's a felony or crime of moral turpitude. Does it have to be a conviction of the felony or the crime of moral turpitude for this to go beyond the 181 days?
It does not have to be conviction.
Just the allegation.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And let's see. Going back to these IA reports, after the assistant chief receives it, does the assistant chief let the chief of police know about some of these disciplines as it relates to shootings and deaths?
Yes.
Okay. And does the chief of police have any input on any discipline of these officers that are involved in these IA reports in possible discipline?
Yes, he does.
Okay. And at what stage does he get to put his input in? And I'll have you answer that question first.
Sure. Well, throughout the internal affairs investigation, ultimately the chief is responsible for the investigation. So if the chief learns about something in the investigation and wants to direct it in a certain manner, the chief can do that. When the case is concluded and has to be a decision where there's discipline, ultimately the chief is the only person other than acting chief that can suspend someone when we're talking about anything from a 3-day suspension up through a termination.
Okay. And if it's less than 3 days, who has the power to suspend an officer?
Per the meet and confer agreement, the captains, now called commanders, have the ability to issue a 1 or 2 day suspension on those minor infractions that could carry a 1 or 2 day suspension.
Okay. And would a shooting be considered that warrants discipline? Would that be considered a minor infraction or more than minor infraction?
Depends on what the sustained citations of misconduct are. It may have started as a shooting case, but during the pendency of the investigation, maybe they found that the officer had not updated their permits to work a second job, or had not actually qualified on the weapon that they had utilized during the police shooting. So the answer to that question is going to be dependent on the citation of misconduct.
Okay, but that wouldn't be, let's say the citation of misconduct is an unreasonable use of force or excessive force per the terms that you decide to use, but you kind of know where I'm going with those terms. What would be the discipline? Would that be considered a minor discipline?
No, that would not be considered minor.
Okay. And what is the scale for that type of discipline if it's found that the discipline is warranted for the excessive or unreasonable use of force?
Well, obviously the top end is indefinite suspension, termination. I don't recall if there's also included in that another category of discipline. I'd have to consult the discipline matrix.
Okay. And does the chief have to wait 180 days? Can he go beyond the 180 days for the suspension, or excuse me, for discipline?
Well, no, the chief is relegated to the 180-day rule.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right, and going back to the IA reports, in discipline, you indicated that from 2010 through 2015, the only individual officer that you know of that was disciplined for use of force was Loosemore, correct?
Well, you said broadly use of force. There are probably many officers who were disciplined for use of force.
Okay. And when I say use of force, I don't mean anything that kind of what you described before, like not having their service weapon up to date and things like that. I mean the actual use, the action of use of force. You're saying that there has been other discipline for use of force within that time frame?
So the actual citation of use of force could include anything from excessive force down to even more minor forms of unnecessary contact. And so the use of force is a broad term from that perspective.
Okay, and that's what I was. So sometimes, the type of use of force that a citation might require to be lodged against the officer might not actually be because the officer used the force improperly, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If an officer is issued a citation for the use of force, if I'm using that correctly, it may not be for the use of force directly. Is that right?
I would have to review the list of citations of misconduct because the citations are generally broad and they cover many different behaviors, and I wouldn't want to give you erroneous information.
Okay. Now, when the use of force is being objected to, when the use of force investigation is occurring, at this scene of an actual investigation, when there's a shooting that's involved, is there such thing called a walkthrough?
In circumstances of officer-involved shootings, yes.
Okay. Tell me what this walkthrough is.
So the walkthrough is an opportunity for the investigators to walk with the officer through the scene to get an understanding of the officer's perspective, the objective facts known to the officer at the time of the use of force, to see proximities, to see locations, and to actually see it in the location where the shooting took place.
Okay. And who's all involved in the walkthrough?
Well, the officer who did the shooting, typically a homicide detective, or more than one sometimes, internal affairs investigator, one or more, the Harris County District Attorney's Office, the officers, Houston Police Officers Union Attorney, if if they choose to have one there, some officers do not subscribe to the Houston Police Officers Union. They may have another attorney. Those are the parties I can think of. They're going to be present for the walkthrough.
Okay, and the officer themselves, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what about if the officer is suspected of committing an offense? Are they also able to be included in the walkthrough?
Well, you know, if the officer doesn't have to do the walkthrough.
Okay.
And so if the officer is suspected of wrongdoing, that's going to be up to the officer and their counsel whether they participate in the walkthrough.
But they're not barred from participating, even though they might be they may have committed the offense, correct?
You're saying would they be barred?
Yes.
No, they would not be barred from it.
Okay. And are the walkthroughs documented in any way?
Yes, they are.
How are they documented?
They're documented by the Homicide Division in their report. It's also documented by the Internal Affairs Investigator in their investigative report.
Okay, so by reports, correct?
Correct.
Okay, is there any audio documentation or video?
I think at times there's audio, but I don't know that it occurs in every situation.
Okay. What would be the situation when an audio documentation would be warranted?
I don't know. That's
So who determines whether an audio or video documentation is warranted?
well, I don't know that they do any video.
Okay. Is there a reason why not?
I don't know.
Okay. Wouldn't it be helpful, though, to do a video documentation of a scene and of the investigation?
I'm not familiar enough with the homicide procedures to know when they do these types of, or you know, if they use audio or video for these types of walkthroughs.
Right, but it would be helpful to have a video of a walkthrough, correct?
It might.
Would it hurt?
It might.
How would it hurt?
Well, I guess it depends on who's the subject of being hurt.
Right, yeah, that's true. Okay. And as far as the has there been any, since 2010 until 2015, has there been any, besides Brian Loosemore, is it Brian Loosemore?
That may be his first name.
Okay. Besides, we'll just say Loosemore.
Okay.
Has there been any discipline by a HPD officer as a result of a shooting or use of force during that time frame that was beyond a, I guess, minor citation?
Well, we'd have to drill down what we mean by minor citation.
I guess the
And-
2 to 3 days, or the 1 or 2 days suspension period, or write-ups. That I think is what you kind of described as a minor citation.
Generally, we talk about a written reprimand, a 1 or 2 day being minor.
Okay. Are there any disciplines that you would describe that were not minor between 2010 and 2015 relating to the use of force by an officer?
I would need discipline charts or at least discipline records to see that.
Okay. What about a shooting?
Well, we talked about Coronado.
Mm-hmm.
That was during that period.
Okay.
And I would need statistics or discipline charts to see if there were any other cases or what other cases there were.
Okay. All right, and then, excuse me, were there any communications between the union as it relates to any discipline in this particular case with the City of Houston regarding these defendants?
I don't know.
Okay. What about any awards? Were there any awards given to these officers relating to this incident?
I don't know if they were given awards as a result.
Okay. Is this a type of incident where an officer would be given an award if, as the investigation shows, that there was an individual who the facts show was pointing a gun at the officers and they were able to defend themselves and shoot the person?
May I object? Beyond the scope.
I'm not familiar enough with all of our awards to know if this is, I've never been on the awards committee.
Okay. Have you ever attended an award?
Sure, I've been to award ceremony. Sure.
Have you received any awards?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And what type of awards have you received?
May I object? Beyond the scope.
I know you want me to hurry up, so I just want to know about his awards real quick.
I did receive a Chief's Commendation for my work on the 2011, I believe it's the 2011 meet and confer. I received a Chief's Commendation for my work on what was referred to as the Westside Chet Holly case, an excessive force case in 2010. And I have a unit Chief's Commendation for the good work that we did in the Legal Services Unit.
Okay. And you said you got an award for the Chet Holly work that you did?
Yes, I did.
What type of work did you do in that case?
So I was an attorney of record on some of the arbitrations of the officers who were indefinitely suspended from that case, from the case.
Okay. And you helped them to be reinstated?
No, I was on behalf of the city.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. All right. And okay. So tell me the measures that the City of Houston takes to scrutinize the use of force cases that end up in the Internal Affairs Department.
Sure. Those steps include doing a full and complete investigation by the Internal Affairs investigator. His or her work is reviewed by the Internal Affairs Lieutenant, to which that investigator reports to. And so the work is checked by the lieutenant, and then the work is checked by the captain of the Internal Affairs Division. And then in 2015, the work would again be checked in the Professional Standards Command. It would also be reviewed in the Discipline Committee if they were looking at potential discipline. It would be reviewed by legal, and it would be reviewed by the Chief of Police.
And with all those reviews, measures, and checks in place, there's still only a limited amount of times that a person, you've only been able to name a few times that an officer has been disciplined as it relates to the use of deadly force or after a shooting, namely Coronado and Loosemore, correct?
Those are the ones I can remember.
Okay. Now, in conducting an IA investigation, whenever the sergeants are actually investigating a complaint and taking witness statements, we noticed in this case that there was a written statement provided by Helder Flores, and there was a written statement made by the defendants, in this case, Officer Harris and Officer Mahood, there was also written statements by the witnesses in this case, which would be Daniel Negron and I believe Edwin Cruz. Now, it is common to get written statements from individuals involved, correct?
So it depends on whether we're talking about the criminal investigation or the administrative investigation.
The internal affairs investigation.
So the internal affairs investigation, the internal affairs investigator wants to be able to get a sworn statement from the witnesses, from any suspects, anyone who's a civilian in the case. Because under Chapter 143, when we look at the civil service law, the best format to get that information is in a sworn statement. Because if we learn of misconduct on behalf of the officer, that has to be in a sworn statement. Otherwise, we cannot use that as the basis of a complaint against the police officer.
Okay. And so the in this case, there were, as I described, all these statements, and they were sworn. And so that is a normal practice of the Internal Affairs Department, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, also in the investigation, there was these statements were not only written and sworn to, they were videotaped as this occurred with some of the individuals, namely the two witnesses, Mr. Negron and Mr. Cruz. Is there a reason why, and I'm sorry, and with Mr. Flores, it was an audio interview. Is there a reason why the officers involved don't have audio interviews or video interviews?
So, I'm not aware of the videos of which you speak, but as far as the officers, the Houston Police Department wants to get their statement on paper so that we can, for lack of a better term, pin them down to their story. We want to get their story on paper, and that's why we want that written statement, because there may be things in a statement that spur further investigation.
Okay. And if that's on video, if that statement's on video, like the other witnesses, how would that stop the goal of pinning, quote unquote, pinning the officers down to their statement?
Well, the practice at the time was to serve the questions that the officer was supposed to answer, serve those to the officer and have them respond by statement. It was not the practice to do video at the time.
Well, the other witnesses, is that the practice now to do video currently?
There have been cases here recently where they have used video to interrogate the officer in the administrative investigation.
Okay. And in 2015, with this particular case, that method was employed for the witnesses but not the officers. And the reason that is, in your opinion, is, I'm sorry, can you explain that to me?
Can there be a point of clarification, because
Sure.
I want to make sure we're not confusing the homicide investigation and the internal affairs investigation. I'm not aware of any video interviews by the internal affairs investigation of the witnesses.
Okay. Right. But you are, but it is clear that internal affairs did not do any type of video or audio interviews or investigations with officers in 2015, correct?
Not that I know of. Oh, of these officers or any officers?
Any officers.
I'm not aware of any.
And the officer, when an officer has a discipline history in their background, is that ever considered in the current discipline proceedings that might be going forward or investigated?
Yes, so there's several steps to determine the proper discipline. It starts with the infraction in the current case, and then the second step is to look and see if there are any same and what we call same or similar cases. And if they're same or similar, it may be that they occurred even a few years ago. They may still, depending on circumstances, be utilized to enhance the case. Or if there are cases within what we call the same disciplinary category, that may enhance the case. That's in the step 2. Then we go to the step 3, and we look at aggravating and mitigating factors. And these are factors throughout the officer's career that may either aggravate the current case, in other words, tend towards a higher discipline, or mitigate, tends towards a lower discipline.
And an officer's history as it relates to the same sort of activity, in this case, use of deadly force. Was that taken into consideration with this officer's, Harris's investigation in this case?
So the disciplinary paperwork is separate from the internal affairs paperwork. I have not reviewed the discipline paperwork.
Okay.
If there was discipline paperwork, I don't even know if it exists.
But you said that it's automatic whenever there's use of force, correct?
A review, but that doesn't mean that a disciplinary worksheet of which I'm speaking about is going to be drafted.
Okay. And what is the disciplinary worksheet? When does that come into existence?
So that is going to be drafted by the officer's division whenever there are sustained citations of misconduct.
So it has to be a sustained allegation of misconduct in order to get the worksheet to become a part of the disciplinary file, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So what about the disciplinary actions that occur prior, or I should say investigation, that occurs prior to an actual worksheet being generated? For example, you stated that with every shooting and death, there's the disciplinary committee that investigates it, correct?
They review it.
Review it, okay. So what happens with that documentation?
Which documentation?
Whatever the disciplinary committee is reviewing, that documentation.
So the disciplinary committee will draft a note that will be attached to the internal affairs case.
Okay.
And it will be their recommendation on the case.
So it's just simply a note. It's not actually a file that's created in the disciplinary committee, correct?
Correct. It's attached to the internal affairs case.
Okay. I guess that helped me clarify that the difference between the disciplinary file and the IA file. So a disciplinary file will be created once there is an actual disciplinary action that is sustained, correct?
They're not two separate files.
Okay.
So if there are sustained citations of misconduct in an internal affairs case, and it goes into the discipline process, that discipline paperwork will be included in the internal affairs case.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And if it's not, it'll just be the note.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, and is there any type of training that occurs after there has been an investigation? Can that be a part of, not necessarily discipline, but a response to a use of force or shooting that ended up going through the investigation stage?
To the first part of your question, can there be some type of remedial training after a discipline? Yes.
Investigation, because it's not really discipline.
Oh, so your question is to what, just the investigation part?
Right. So it didn't rise to a level of where they want to discipline this officer, but they did have some concerns, which is why it kind of went through the channels. Is there any type of training offered or mandated after that type of situation?
That is possible, yes.
Okay. And then now going back to, in the event there is actual discipline sustained, is there training in that instance?
Not every discipline has remedial training attached to it, but there are many instances of an officer getting disciplined, and he or she will also be sent for additional training or remedial training.
Okay. And when you say remedial training, what does that mean?
I use that in the sense of there's been a deficiency that has come to light through the internal affairs investigation, and we want to correct that deficiency by sending that officer back through. It could be training that the officer has already received, and they're going to go through it again or go through a similar form of that training to correct that deficiency.
You
You need a break, whatever you can get.
Okay. Let me just ask this series of questions, and I'll be ready to break in just a moment. The remedial training, how is that documented if it's necessary for an officer to go through remedial training?
So a couple different ways. It may be by order of the chief, and in that circumstance, there'll be a letter drafted, what we call a inter-office correspondence, that will go to a couple of different ways it could go. It could go to the training division to have this training take place. It could go to the officer's chain of command, and in that case, the letter would say, make sure this officer goes to this particular training. The other way it could occur, the Houston Police Department has what's called the Education and Training Options program, which is at any time, even before there's a citation of misconduct, the supervisor notices a deficiency in an officer, they can send them for additional training.
All right, we can go ahead and break. Well, it's 3:59. I mean 3:49.
Yeah, I guess
Are we off the record?
we can stay on the record. The lieutenant has a commitment at 4, so he wanted to be out of here by 4, right?
Yes, my daughter's birthday party is tonight, and it's a long way to the Woodlands area, so I'd like to get on the road before the traffic gets too bad.
Okay.
All right, so we are going to continue this deposition, and we'll notice the city to continue this deposition, and I guess we can go off the record.
This concludes the portion for today's deposition for Lieutenant Bradley Morefield. The time is 3:50 p.m. We're off the record.